Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us as we look at the impact of AI on the communications function and specifically how technology is going to help us collectively optimize, measure, and increase the impact of our work. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. The session will be recorded, and we will send a copy of the recording to everyone who's registered. And second, if you've got any questions during the session, please just use the Zoom's Q&A function. We're going to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. I've made sure to have enough time at the end for that purpose. So as we dive in, my name is Brian Buchwald. I lead the product development function at Edelman. I've been at the company for a little over a year, so I'm relatively new to Edelman, but I'm not new to the communication space. I've been working in and around the function since 2017. When I sold an AI company actually to one of Edelman's competitors. But before I actually entered the communications business, I spent most of my career in first the early commercial internet. So I worked at companies like Morgan Stanley, advising early internet companies like Netscape and AOL. And then as a strategy executive at a company called DoubleClick when it was still an independent firm before it was sold to Google for $3 billion. And then I moved into media and digital media. I was on the founding team of Hulu, and I ran a number of digital businesses for NBC Universal. And during my career, prior to joining Edelman, I've seen lots of really interesting developments in the internet, in the online advertising space, in the streaming world, in the broadcasting world. And none of those developments compare to what we're seeing today and with AI. And specifically from my perspective, what's most interesting is how AI is starting to actually impact the work that we do as communicators. So my goal for the next hour is hopefully to imbue all of you with some of my enthusiasm for why this is such a critical moment in time and such an opportunity, but also to hopefully give you lots of practical information for how you can leverage this opportunity as well. Before we dive into that, I wanted to just set some context for where the global holistic AI conversation is today. And in short, we've seen incredible innovation in the AI space across sectors, across society, across cultures, across countries. It's impacting healthcare. We're getting to a point where AI is helping to prevent heart attacks. It's impacting transportation, where despite what you read about autonomous vehicles, AI is increasingly helping us avoid accidents and fatalities on the road. And it's impacting education, where children who may have been held back by COVID are now using personalized education to actually leapfrog where they were previously. But despite all that, skepticism exists. It's real. There are questions that are relatively practical around things like fear of job displacement, privacy. But there are also larger philosophical questions that are being asked around the autonomy of AI or the loss of human control. And people feel these on a very real basis. So for instance, at Edelman, we recently ran a trust barometer that looked at the question on AI as well as other more recent or less recent innovations as well. And what we found was a society that's split on how much they actually accept or embrace innovation in AI relative to rejecting it. And you can see here the numbers are 35 to 39. So we're at this moment in time where it's a relative tipping point in terms of how people will look at it. And we see this ambiguity in media coverage as well. So the green line here is actually negative, the blue is positive, and this is discussion of AI within the media landscape. And that's actually also seconded when we look at social media. The green line again is negative, the blue is positive. In fact, you see an even larger delta or difference between the two. Although it's interesting, and if you look below, you see lines that are dotted, and those lines are the same conversation pulling out bots. So when we think about this conversation, as a media, as a societal conversation, there's also bad actors that are creating even greater deltas or differences between negative and positive. When we put this all in the context of the overall conversation, this polarized conversation, we see it's not even necessarily as polarized as we thought it might be. So just to give some context again, the black line here is the neutral dialogue in social media. And in fact, we see that that dwarfs both the positive and negative. So ultimately, the question that's being asked by society, by our fellow citizens, by our stakeholders, by our employees and our colleagues is, well, how do I ultimately trust AI or trust other innovations? And essentially, it comes down to a very simple question of, do I expect and do I trust those bringing about this innovation to act responsibly, and can they act in a competent manner? Seems really simple, but when we looked at similar conversations around GMOs or gene-based medicine or green energy, we see very similar effects of this question of, do I believe that folks will act responsibly, and do they have a competent understanding of what they're actually undertaking? This is especially critical in 2024. This is truly the year of AI adoption. When we looked at a recent Forrester report, we saw 90% of business decision makers planning to implement AI or generative AI in their work. And we saw roughly 64% of our colleagues within PR and communications having already incorporated AI into their work, and more doing so every day. So this begets the question for us collectively, which is, what do we do? If society is not the only group showing this skepticism, but even potentially our peers are, and people within our industry, how do we get out ahead of the challenge of skepticism? And how do we drive this evolution together versus potentially losing control? So how do we ensure that we are the ones in the driver's seat and not in the passenger seat? And that's what I'm going to talk about for the next roughly 30 minutes, and hopefully work with the folks on this call, both to convince you that this is our opportunity, but also that we can work as an industry to get us there. So stepping back, the questions regarding AI success and obviously acting responsibly and competently is not just a philosophical question, right? It's not just a question of, well, if AI works, therefore, what should I do? The question also becomes for us as communicators, well, how do I make AI work in the first place? And I'm going to start with the biggest challenge as it exists today, and we're going to walk through this step by step, is the data challenge. Before I dive into the data challenge, I want to give you a little bit of a story from my career and my life. I in the early 2000s was a strategy executive again at a company called DoubleClick. For those who were not around and working at that time, DoubleClick was one of the largest ad tech companies, in fact, the largest ad tech company in the world at that time. And the name of the company was literally DoubleClick. The expectation was people would double click on ads. And when the dot-com bubble burst, we wound up in a position of having a product that effectively didn't match the name of the company because people didn't double click on ads. And the advertising sector online essentially cratered, and a lot of people lost their jobs, and a lot of businesses went bankrupt. There was one company, a very small company based in Mountain View, California, that took a very different view. Instead of focusing on big splashy banner ads and videos, this company had this revolutionary idea, which was, if there is a person searching for an item on Yahoo or on Alta Vista or on Lycos, and they're searching for a bicycle shop, lo and behold, there's a good chance that they actually want to buy a bicycle. And so this company started to place ads based on the context and the behavior of the user. And this little company out of Mountain View was Google. And Google actually wound up buying DoubleClick over time for roughly $3 billion. And what Google figured out, and really, now it seems very matter of course, but at the time it wasn't matter of course, was that if they could connect insight, what people are thinking, or gathering intelligence very quickly to action, right? I can then show them an ad that drives them directly to, for instance, a website. They had a real opportunity in front of them. And meanwhile, in our communications industry, we're still hampered by challenges that Google was able to address with data over 20 years ago. So I mentioned systems of insight and systems of action, just to give some definition to those. A system of action is something like a media monitoring tool or a social listening tool. It's something that makes you smart. It gives you insight into human behavior or whatever it is you're tracking that can lead to strategy or creative or something effectively that can move the ball forward for your company. A system of action is literally the system that drives the action. It could be an email system. It could be a content management system. It's the element that drives the next best action for your organization. And what's happened in the online advertising sector and in the ad tech space is effectively a minimization or, in fact, an obliteration of the gap between systems of insight and systems of action. And it's cost hundreds of billions of dollars. So if you think about Meta and Alphabet and virtually any of the biggest media companies, all of them have put billions and billions of dollars against obliterating that gap between systems of insight and systems of action. And for communicators, when I entered this space in 2017, this was one of the things that got me so excited about it. Because if we could do the same thing, if we could solve our data challenge and start to link insight to action more effectively and to show the ROI of our work relative to business KPIs, then we were on to something. I'm going to define a little bit more of what I mean by the data challenge before I get into how I think we can solve it. The first is a question of volume. We deal with a ton of data. If I'm running an ad tech platform like a trade desk, I'm dealing with maybe 5 to 10,000 what I call permutations that I need to optimize around. But for instance, for one auto client, I did recent analysis for that company with 26 million social posts, 400 million engagements, 12,000 different product reviews around roughly 10, actually, I think it was actually 11 car models. So the point here is we actually deal with a lot of data. Sometimes people think about communications as less mathematical or less data intensive than, for instance, paid media or direct media. The truth is that we deal with a lot more data that has to be wrangled. The second challenge is the complexity of the data that we work with. There are a ton of point solutions out there, but for any one client at Edelman, we have basic social listening, we have Instagram listening, we have LinkedIn listening, we have journalist databases, we have broadcast data, we have search engine optimization, we're running surveys and audience segmentation, we have product reviews and employee reviews that we have to analyze. All of this may be relevant to one campaign or one goal that we're looking to accomplish for our client. And the companies that occupy these different sectors, whether it's social listening or running in-depth interviews or influencer selection and management, most of them are point solutions. They're not platforms that work across multiple areas of need. They're solving one particular problem. And the problem for us as communicators is we're not solving the point solution. We're looking to solve for the larger goal of driving corporate reputation or driving market share or something that is much more, again, related to the bigger picture of what we're trying to accomplish. So how do we move from a place of trying to solve by best guesses off of these point solutions to something that gives us empirical answers to the problems that face us? And lastly is the question of specificity related to this data challenge. So this was actually a great quote that came out of a recent future of corporate communications work at Edelman, where one of our clients said, the challenge for a lot of us in our function is how close can we get to actually measuring business impact? It's hard to say this article led to a client in engagement. So advertising and media works at a people-based level. If you look at a Publicis or a WPP, or if you look at any of the other large holding companies and they've bought the Axioms of the world or the Merkles, what they're effectively doing is looking to tie behavioral data that they capture from many different databases to a cookie or to a unique anonymous identifier so that they can show you a more effective ad or generate more effective creative to influence you. Our sector as communicators, we don't work with people level data. We work with population level data for privacy reasons and for a variety of reasons, including the mediums through which we communicate. And what that means is it becomes a lot harder to show, for instance, that article or that social media post led to a direct action because we're dealing with populations and we're not dealing with the individual. Although, again, I think that this can change. And we're not the only ones, obviously, believing that this opportunity is out there. There's a host of companies that have effectively taken up the mantle of AI within the comms tech space that you can be partnering with to infuse AI into your workflows. Of course, then it becomes the question of, well, which ones and for what purpose and to drive what type of impact and how do I actually get them to work most effectively together? And that's what we're going to spend some time talking about now. So the question really then becomes, how can we leverage AI to transform communications? Well, the first thing that AI, and more specifically large language models or generative AI as well, is helping us do is to increase the speed and the efficiency of the work we do. I mentioned I sold an AI company to an Edelman peer a few years ago. When that occurred, we were running analyses and building insights that would take sometimes a few hours, but often and most often it would take days or weeks or even months. And it might be taking, for instance, 50,000 articles and trying to measure trust or measure the propensity for a brand to be seen as innovative. That same work now can be done in an instant. So as we think again about systems of insight, how do I get smart? How do I get that creative nugget that can lead to the next great campaign or the next great social media post or the next great communication or the next great article written about my company? That insight that used to take days or weeks or months to create can now be done instantly. And what that means is if I can take that insight and break it down into its data parts, I can then attach it to action. So for instance, if I think about something like content optimization or how I message test, I can look at advanced algorithms that analyze these vast data sets for nuanced insights in the moment. I can build hyper-personalized messaging. I can run simulation testing, again, message testing in the moment, and adapt those messages based upon those simulations. And then I can use an iterative feedback loop, right? So every second I can be optimizing to actually get the best result out of my creative, not because I put days and weeks into building out the insight, but because I got to that insight almost instantly. And I've been able to then alter it, edit it, and optimize it in the moment using what would have been, let's say, 100,000 testers just using machines. This is now at our fingertips. So the concept of moving with speed and efficiency is now truly upon us. Precision and predictability. If I have to be speedy and efficient, I also have to make sure that the work I'm doing is precise and powerful. This is a little bit of a story for what's been going on for us on our journey at Edelman. I oversee a team that is building something called TrustStream. We'll talk a little bit about that more later. But within the work we're doing for TrustStream, we've been training models for the last 3 years. And we had an outsourced firm in India through which we would run our models, and they would score the data for trust and for different what we call pillars of trust. And we had roughly 22% accuracy with the way that the humans scored for trust, which was a challenge. And we got to roughly 74% relevance. So for instance, if they were scoring an article, would they accurately be able to say consistently as to whether the article was relevant for a brand, and was the score then again accurate? And we noticed something really interesting about 6 months ago. The outsourced firm that was running these human fine-tuning exercises for us started to get much more accurate, and their training started to get much more relevant. And all of it became much more uniform. So for instance, if you gave the same article to 10 people, sometimes we get 8 different results. Now we were getting uniform results. And my lead data scientist dove into this and basically figured out that our human tuning partner was using large language models to drive that type of impact. And we realized that it was silly for us to continue to go down the path of human effectively intervention versus just using our own trust large language model, which is what we did. And our accuracy rose from 22% to 78%. The relevance, the ability to, again, accurately predict whether an article was relevant to a particular brand went from 74% to 91%. The difference between 22 and 78 and 74 to 91 for us meant we went from being inaccurate to precise, and from oftentimes sharing irrelevant content to be highly predictable about what would actually matter for a brand. As this all came together, right? So as we thought about speed and efficiency, precision and predictability, the next piece was for us and for the industry to say, okay, well, if I can do that, to what effect? And what I mean by to what effect is quite simply, if I'm just doing the same thing as the person or the company next to me, if I'm a pharmaceutical company and I'm doing the same thing as another pharmaceutical company, if I'm an auto company and I'm effectively using the same data and I'm running the same processes, and maybe I have smarter people, but those people leave every day at 7 p.m. or 5 p.m. and they could go and work at a different firm. How do I think about building competitive differentiation? And that starts with effectively, what is your ownable asset, right? What is it that your company stands for? So for instance, at Edelman, it's trust. For another company, we'll talk about some examples. It could be access to a certain type of video, or it could be a certain understanding of color, or whatever it might be. But there's something that is ownable at all of our companies that we want to start with. And then the goal is to say, well, if I understand what that is, how do I start to model against it, right? So how do I start to try and make whatever is ownable for me, for my company, even better? And as I start to get an improvement through those modeling, how do I go out and collect more data, right? So how do I bring more information in that makes my model more powerful, that continuously improves the quality and the accuracy of the AI, right? So how do I continue to fine tune the model? And then that becomes the ownable asset, and this becomes a virtuous loop where it goes around and around and around. So I'm creating real competitive differentiation. So I'm using speed and efficiency, I'm using precision and predictability to drive competitive differentiation. And then I'm using that competitive differentiator to create a moat around my ownable asset. Just a couple examples of how this has worked in the real world. Shutterstock was founded by a guy named John Oringer. John was a computer scientist, but also a photographer. And he started Shutterstock with his own images. And they became a billion-dollar plus public company, just based on the ability to compete with Getty first off of John's own photographic library. Now, as Shutterstock looked at where they needed to be best of breed in AI, they realized obviously it had to do with AI image editing. So how did they get better at making photographs better? How did they get better as being essentially a photo repository for all of us? And so their ownable asset were the 750 million pictures within their library. And what they've been doing for the last couple of years is really continuing to refine and model against those 750 million pictures, right, to make their image editor better so that more people want to use their image editor and more photos come into their library, and it becomes, again, that virtual loop. And that's why we're seeing today, not just companies like Shutterstock, but Bloomberg as it relates to media, or Reddit, leveraging the community on their platform, really starting to build out AI-powered data strategies built on their own data, right, their ownable asset, in a way in which it creates proprietary differentiation. I mentioned at Edelman, our path has been around trust. So for 20 plus years, we've been running the trust barometer. Our investment in TrustStream is really about creating a GPS navigator, or something that can measure trust at any given time for any company and to understand what is driving trust and how trust is likely to change over time. So what we did, just to give you a little bit of a peek behind the scenes, was about 3 years ago, we started to collect our own proprietary surveys on roughly 200 brands all over the world. We made that investment on our own. We weren't sharing it with clients or with the market. It was really just for us. Concurrent to that, we started to collect digital data, roughly 3 million articles and social posts a day. And what we've done over the last couple of years is build a direct understanding of how those articles and that digital data impacts trust to 97% accuracy. So this really becomes valuable for us if we work with our clients because A, with 97% accuracy, I can tell you how your trust will change over time and why. And B, we have an understanding of the atomic level, that kind of granular level of which articles or which social media posts are driving those responses. And going back to what we were talking about earlier regarding systems of insight and systems of action, now we get to a place where, for instance, through our work with TrustStream, we can link all of this global comms data, whether it's social data or news data or employee reviews, directly to trust and the drivers of trust. And then we can use econometric modeling and AI to actually build an understanding of how trust impacts sales. So I can go from a CNN article to the drivers of trust to sales. And in fact, we do this with clients all around the world. We have one client recently where we were able to model out for them, for instance, a 1 percentage point increase in their trust score would actually create $100 million of incremental sales, so roughly 0.2% lift in global sales for their organization. And what's so important about this, from my perspective, as I share it with all of you, is this isn't an academic exercise. This isn't just saying a 1% lift in trust, but actually we could point to specifically what they could do to get that 1% increase in trust to drive the incremental $100 million in sales. And that, again, is about moving with speed and efficiency, precision and predictability, figuring out what the competitive differentiation is, and bridging that gap between an insight directly to an action. All right, so where do we get started, right? If I was joining Edelman tomorrow, or if I was joining one of your organizations, and many of you are probably well along your journey, but where would I get started? Well, first, this sounds relatively anodyne, but it's about identifying the opportunity. You need to choose a strategic direction that actually meets the needs of your company, and to build a plan around that allows for flexibility in tactics. Okay, what do I mean by that? Strategy needs to be durable, right? We need to understand why we exist, why we do what we do, and how it can impact society or culture or our industry in a way in which it will obviously help our company, but help our clients, et cetera. The tactics that we use, especially in the world of LLMs and generative AI, need to be highly flexible, because what works today doesn't work tomorrow. One of the things I stress with my team is, yes, there are assets that we want to own. For instance, we built a trust LLM, but concurrent to that, we don't want to own all of the AI. In fact, we want to own very little of it. What we want to own is the workflows and driving the optimization in terms of the automation and how we can seamlessly inject AI into our systems. That means that if, for instance, tomorrow Google comes out with a much better product than Gemini, I want to be able to bring it into the work that we're doing as a company instead of being married to another vendor. Just a couple more things as you think about the opportunity. Ensure that the opportunity is specific enough to be achievable. In my career, and especially in the last couple of years, I've seen lots of AI efforts fail because folks try and do too much, and they're trying to meet the needs of too many individuals at once. Start small, start specific. Again, make sure it ladders up to the strategic goals of your organization, but make sure you're biting off something you can actually chew. And make sure it's ownable for your company and does create that tangible value, right? So as we think about it through the lens of communicators, one of my focus areas for Edelman is how do we move from comms KPIs to business KPIs on behalf of our clients? So how do we help them not just prove, but also improve the value of their work related to corporate reputation, market share, sales, even market value, right? This becomes a way in which, again, from a senior level, it becomes much more understandable about why we're doing what we're doing. So identify the opportunity, make sure you have a strategy that's durable, but allow for flexibility of tactics. As you think about the team that you want around you, you got to start with a realistic budget and timeline so that you can make this durable and something that actually lasts. And the reason why I bring this up is oftentimes companies will show a number, for instance, to finance that essentially underbids what the actual cost will be and the time will be required of the work. And what that means is you get that initial investment, but the investment ultimately goes away because it takes longer and it costs more than you thought it would take. The mix of how you should be building should be part FTE, so people that are part of your team are fully bought into the concept, but also consultants, freelancers, and others that become much more of a variable cost that you can scale up or down based on the need. From my perspective, having done this now a few times and worked with many clients going through this, 3 areas you want in-house: a technical architect, somebody that can help you really think about the cloud landscape, think about the different systems you may need; a data scientist, this is the person who can both build models, but also optimize third-party models that you're going to need on your team; and an analyst. We talked about systems of insight and systems of action. You need somebody on the team that can actually draw out that insight and communicate it effectively and understand where the value is in the data that you're capturing. So again, for me, I start with a technical architect, a data scientist, and an analyst. The second piece in building your team. In the words of Hillary Clinton, it takes a village. You got to make sure you have partners across the different pieces of your organization. HR, legal, finance, IT, whoever it is, you need to bring them along for a variety of reasons. You need to bring along finance because, for instance, you may be making investments in software that can be amortized over time or capitalized so that the costs don't hit your P&L directly in the first year. You need your legal partners because you're going to be dealing with some stuff that could lead to challenges down the line with clients, and you want to make sure that you have the right compliance framework in place. You need HR on board. You're suddenly hiring people that may not have been typically part of the communications team at your company. You need IT involved. Oftentimes, there are security measures and systems in place that have been set up to safeguard your company, but may actually cause issues for how you're trying to leverage, for instance, generative AI. And these are moments where you're going to have to make the right trade-offs and create flexibility within that IT infrastructure that your company's put in place. And lastly, this is probably most important. The leader of your team has to know the underlying space of the company in order to effectively guide the effort. And again, this may seem cliche or it may seem so obvious, but so many times I've seen companies fail, not because they didn't have a great idea, not because they didn't have a great team, but they hired a leader who didn't actually understand the underlying space. They may have come in as an expert in AI, but they didn't understand communications, or they didn't understand how to communicate in a healthcare setting, or they didn't really understand the auto industry. What you want as a leader is somebody who clearly has the intellectual curiosity and capacity to get the AI function and to hire the right people, but they really need to know the space, because if you're going to make investments to drive an ownable asset forward in a way in which it creates that proprietary value, well, you need somebody to be making the right decisions as it relates to your business. And lastly, creating the infrastructure. So if I've got the plan in place, if I have the team in place and I know what I'm building, I've got to have the right infrastructure. That is the modeling, it's the software, it's the hardware, it's the cloud, et cetera. This piece should come last. It should come out of the strategic opportunity and an understanding of what your budget is, right? So if you need to start with a single brick, Start with the single brick and build from there, but do so in a way in which what you're building becomes scalable for your organization. The reality is, for nearly all of us, most of your investment, if not 99%, is going to be in third-party solutions. I showed the chart of the comms text landscape. We didn't even touch on the cloud solutions. We didn't even touch on a number of other pieces that you're going to need to focus on. But as you think about the infrastructure, make sure that the pieces fit together. And this is something that my team, for instance, at Edelman could help you with, but I'm sure there are people at your own companies that could help you with. The point here is, if you're working with different point solutions that operate in different languages, or something only works in AWS and something else only works in Azure, you're putting yourself in a position where it won't actually fit. So as you're building and you're using third-party solutions, always be mindful of that integration or that interoperability. And the second point is, take the time to include compliance and governance as part of this infrastructure framework. So compliance and governance are critical to both ensuring that the investment is sound, but also that you have the back of your organization and your organization has your back, right? You're doing things that have passed the legal test, the finance test, the ethical test, et cetera, because most of us are now operating using platforms that are still speculative in nature, right? They're not 100% foolproof. We've seen that with Gemini in the last couple of weeks. We've seen it with OpenAI and some of the challenges that they've had with ChatGPT and hallucinations, right? We want to do everything we can to safeguard our companies' reputations, and those of the clients who may be impacted by the downstream use of whatever we're creating. That could be a patient, that could be a buyer of an automobile, that could be somebody eating our food, whatever that might be. And if we get this all right, this is a moment of investment and what I call reinvestment. So if we understand what our force multiplier is, a force multiplier is what it is that's going to create unique proprietary value for our organization, make that your number one priority in terms of investment. Get the buy-in from the top, right? Foster understanding with your manager, with the leaders at your company, that this is a marathon and not a sprint. Again, not trying to throw out cliches, but it's true. If this is a marathon, we're in the second mile of a 26-mile race. The winners have not yet been declared. In fact, everybody's still basically at the starting line, whether you're an AI software company, whether you're Google or Meta or Microsoft, or whether you're one of us that are leveraging these platforms to try and make our work better. The reality is, this is a learning time. This is an iteration time for all of us, even the biggest and best companies in the space. The last point, be an evangelist. Push the commitment of your team, your partners, and your manager with a vision for what the future can be, right? So if you know from a strategic perspective why you're pursuing what you're pursuing, if you understand from your perspective what that vision needs to be for how your company should evolve its communications function, how you should be linking your communications work to the business KPIs of your organization, why you should be getting bigger budget, why you should be able to hire more people, whatever the rationale may be, an infectious and inclusive vision, right, that gets everybody bought in is going to really help you get there. I found in my career, if you're infectious but not inclusive, it doesn't really get you where you need to be. If you're inclusive, but you haven't essentially elicited the imagination of your colleagues, it almost doesn't matter either. Be infectious, be inclusive, be the evangelist, get strategic buy-in, understand your force multiplier, and you're off and running. Those are all my slides. I thought I'd make this more a little bit more for the next 15, 20 minutes of a Q&A and a dialogue now between all of us.
Cool. Well, thank you, Brian. We got a bunch of really great questions in the chat. One that's, I think is a good one to ask is, you showed that slide with all the logos, all the different companies that everyone on the call might be able to work with. How do we go about actually deciding on a vendor and evaluating a potential partner?
It's a great question. So one of the things I guess I'll lead with is understand again strategically what you're trying to accomplish and realize that sometimes great ideas or great pitches still deserve a no. There's so much cool stuff emanating in the market. You need to really look for the tools and the vendors that are going to be most helpful to your specific exercise and what you're trying to accomplish. The second piece I'd say is date before you marry with a vendor. Run tests. Ensure they can actually do what they say they can do. Call some of their clients. Make sure that they've actually succeeded for companies that look like you. There are a host of companies out there right now that have just slapped AI or generative AI next to their name. There are a lot of people out there selling candidly snake oil. There are a lot of companies out there that are just trying to gain budget from bigger companies that have access to budget. Our job, again, is to be responsible stewards of our corporate capital, which means as communicators, what are we trying to accomplish through PR and communications, right? What is our organization more, holistically trying to improve, and what does success look like? How am I linking those? And is this vendor really going to help me on my direct path?
Second question is, can you talk about the role that AI can play in sentiment analysis? Several monitoring tools have automated scoring, but are inaccurate. For example, they don't do well with sarcasm or with words that seem negative but are used in a positive context.
Yeah, and this is I'm going to break this into a couple different answers. So actually, right before I joined Edelman, I was the chief strategy officer of a company called Talkwalker, where we had sentiment models and we competed with other companies with sentiment models. What I'd say broadly is that any company with an out-of-the-box sentiment model is working across industry and they're trying to solve for the lowest common denominator. So we talk about things like accuracy and precision. They're just trying to meet a minimal hurdle. Now, they want to do the best for all of their clients, but if you have 500 clients or 5,000 clients, you want to make sure you're succeeding for all those clients, which means you're not trying to optimize for one. What that means is the responsibility comes on all of us to say, if sentiment is an important indicator or something that I want to leverage in my work, I need to be able to train the sentiment models to be valuable for my organization. So for instance, the company that I sold to one of Weber's, or excuse me, it was Weber Shandwick. We spent a lot of time building out sentiment models that were far more accurate and precise than the social listening companies or media monitoring companies, not because I had better data scientists, but because we understood, for instance, the role of communications. We understood the role of communications in healthcare, and we would optimize models for sentiment for communications in healthcare. So this is, again, goes back to why, for me, having a technical architect, having a data scientist, having an analyst on the team becomes immensely helpful because you can help yourself.
We got a few questions about the trust stream approach of basically, connecting trust to sales. I know you sort of spoke to it in the presentation. Is there any more context or color you can give to that process? 'Cause we got a few questions about that.
Yep. So one of the things that I obsess over is this relationship between communications and sales, or communications and market share. One of the biggest frustrations I've had since entering the communication space is oftentimes our clients and colleagues don't have access even to, for instance, sales data or commercial data that becomes necessary to build that correlation or that relationship between our activities and actual sales or market share changes. So the first thing I'd say is, as communicators, we need to work with our colleagues, whether it's in marketing or in finance or operations, to get access to the commercial data. Once we have access to the commercial data, there are tools, there's the cloud, there are other things that exist today that make it relatively easy to commingle that data. So if I can take my comms data and I can take my social data and I can take my commercial data and bring it into one place, econometric modeling makes it relatively straightforward to provide those linkages. Why I think this is so important is it starts to put us as communicators back in the driver's seat of understanding exactly how our work is impacting our organization commercially, but it also puts us in a position to be on equal footing to marketing, who oftentimes is owning the attribution model or the media mix models that are defining the investment for my company. So getting access to the commercial data or even third-party commercial market share data from like an NPD or a Kantar is a good start. And then ensuring that I can commingle that data and build those econometric relationships that will get you 80% there. And anybody on the call who wants my advice on how to do it, I'm happy to talk about this after the call, because this is something that I think is critical and fascinating.
We got a question about the ability, you mentioned media as a driver of trust. Can you talk a bit about the role that this can play in sort of measuring employee sentiment, for example, content on the internet or sort of coverage about the employee experience?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So whether there's a Slack channel or there are other ways in which you can track information, obviously, ideally anonymously of employees and third-party platforms like a Glassdoor or others or Fishbowl, it becomes really valuable. Now, I have found that the Glassdoors and the Fishbowls of the world are usually highly skewed, although they're highly skewed across many companies, but they're usually skewed because either A, it's people who are going to complain and maybe have an axe to grind that are most likely to post, or even for a lot of companies, I've seen HR and other groups really solicit positive feedback on those platforms. So I tend to discount the data coming from those platforms, although it's usually uniformly inconsistent, which means that I can still look at one organization against another. Using anonymous data either internally from like a Slack channel or from, for instance, Net Promoter, NPS surveys that you're running constantly with your teams becomes really valuable. And very similar to how you can build a trust model or build a reputational model for third-party media data or social data, you can do the same thing for your employees. And what I found is oftentimes I look at it as almost a four quadrant. So one quadrant is perception, right? Another quadrant is results. Another quadrant is activity. And another quadrant is communication. So, perception, results, activity, and communications. That model is almost more important for employees than for anybody else because employees are often the canary in the coal mine. As they go, the company will go. So if you are driving the right activities, driving the right communications, building the right perception with your employees, you get to the right results.
This is a build on the vendor question. You mentioned there being some snake oil salesmen in the market. What are some ways to tell a company that has the goods versus one that's just slapping the AI label on something
Yeah,
else?
I mean, so one is client references, right? So are they working with companies that you know, that you've heard of, that you respect? Are you able to call those references and ensure that the product is as they say it is and what's worked well, what hasn't worked well? If you're going to make a 10,000 or 25,000 or $5 million investment in a third party, you have the right to ask those questions and ensure you're getting answers that meet your satisfaction. The other is to test. And this goes back to, again, if you have a team within your own company or your own organization that can run those tests, whether they're a data scientist or an architect or an analyst or others, check the data. Right? If somebody tells you that they have the greatest journalist database that's ever lived and they can help you pinpoint what journalist to reach out to for what story, and they can optimize the topic and they can optimize the text, and it can put you in a position where you're guaranteed to get a certain level of media uptake, and then you can tie that data to sales or whatever it might be. Run a test, ask for limited access, get 2 weeks of free access before you actually sign on, so that you can actually ensure that the product works. I would say in our sector right now, nearly all companies that we work with, they mean well, but oftentimes companies will sell ahead of capability, and it's up to us to actually gauge the capability versus their ability to sell effectively.
There's a question about greenwashing, but I think it applies more broadly to claims that are made to market in general. What impact can this process or these tools have on helping companies avoid charges of greenwashing or the equivalent, right? Of just ensuring that, I think this is sort of a messaging question of ensuring that the messaging matches reality.
Yeah, and for me, I mentioned before, I see this need for a symbiosis between perception, results, activity, and communications. All of these elements right now, if you think about it, need to be in balance. If your company is going to be successful in the long term, and especially as you start to leverage like generative AI and large language models and AI more broadly, it only works if those pieces are actually heading in the right direction together. So greenwashing, from my perspective, is often a result of trying to put a perspective of something from a communications perspective on results or activities that aren't really there. So this is a way that we can hold ourselves accountable as almost our own X-ray through AI, through large language models, to ensure that the results, the communications, the activities, and the perception all effectively match.
We got a few questions about sort of the process of building in-house versus leveraging third-party solutions. Some CIOs prefer to build stuff from scratch, whereas others are more comfortable working with vendors. The question is basically, how do you balance those two forces? How do you think about when to build and when to buy, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, I think unless you're, well, I think, even if we have clients on this call, for instance, who work at the biggest software companies in the world or biggest hardware companies in the world, even there, from a comms perspective, they likely don't have the budget to do everything in-house. So even the biggest, most successful technology companies aren't going to do this all in-house. So the bias should be towards finding best-of-breed vendors that solve the specific needs of what you're trying to accomplish. Again, laddering back to that strategic objective for our comms function. But that force multiplier, right? That ownable asset, that's where you should be investing in your own capabilities, in your own tools. That doesn't mean, for instance, you're building your own large language model and fine-tuning it with your own testing data and everything happens in-house. No, you still can be using third-party solutions along the way, but there's an element of it that you want to own so that as your employees go home at night or, society changes or culture changes, you have that underlying asset that is yours, that it doesn't matter if people leave, it's still part of your company. So what I would recommend is, bias to third-party solutions, because you've got to scale and they're going to make investments in their unique assets in a way in which you need to make investments in your unique assets, but find your own force multiplier and invest in that. And again, I don't know how many people are on the call, but if anybody wants to reach out and talk to me about what that might be for you and how you might want to think about that trade-off, I'm really happy to do so, because to me, this is the crux of what makes you successful, understanding where to start and what you need to own versus what can be third party.
We got time for one or two more. This is a sort of a broader question about AI, less specific to some of the trust stream stuff, for example. But what role can AI play when it comes to overcoming language and cultural barriers? For example, if you are a team that has international audiences.
Right. Well, let's separate language and culture, because while they're related, they're obviously not the same. If we were to look at how language translation has actually improved in the last couple years, it is a revolution relative to an evolution over the prior, call it 10 to 15 years. So for instance, 3 years ago, if I was building an AI model and I needed something in Spanish and something in English and something in Portuguese, I'd effectively have to build 3 different models. Now the AI translation capabilities that are endemic to even a platform like Google are good enough that I can translate things into English, and then I can run one model, which means I'm much more efficient and I'm much more cost effective in terms of how I do this work. The cultural piece, this is going to be improved with AI, right? Because AI can start to read some of this, but it kind of related back to the question somebody mentioned earlier about sentiment and sarcasm. There's still some things that require some human element, right? So as we think about a human in the loop, this is one of those things where AI will translate effectively. They'll come up with a recommendation, but if you have a team in China, there should be somebody on your Chinese team that understands the cultural nuance and whether it's relevant to China, in part because the data that's available from place to place is going to be inconsistent. My ability to understand consumer behavior in China is very different because the internet is less open from what we have, for instance, in the United States or in the West. So the way in which AI will essentially judge or make recommendations is going to be off based upon the fact that the data is just not uniform, nor are the culture. So this is an area where I think the human in the loop becomes super important.
Cool. Last question. This is about the reputational risk of AI, specifically when it is being used in an unethical way. You sort of touched on this at the beginning when you talked about the trust barometer findings from this year. The question is, what are the potential reputational risks of unethical implementation or use of AI?
I mean, the reputational risk of unethical implementation of AI is your company can go from a productive, profitable company to out of business. I think that the risks are that great. Now that's again, if you're propagating something that is knowingly untrue, or if you're leveraging a system that, for instance, is built on sand versus a solid infrastructure. What I'd say more prescriptively is if you have a sound compliance framework, if you have the right governance in place, the likelihood that you will create systemic risk for your organization using AI is incredibly low, as long as you're making those right bets at the outset and you're creating essentially a framework that will enable you to operate, but also to ensure, for instance, ethical compliance. It's not easy. It costs money. It takes time. Sometimes doesn't allow us to move as quickly as we'd like, but that is the way that you ensure you don't get into that systemic risk environment or situation.
So we are at time. We will end it there. Thank you all for joining. If you have any follow-up questions for Brian on any of these topics, his email will be in the recap note that we send after this. But thank you all for joining.
Thank you, everyone.